Hey friends, Catherine here. I have a topic for you today that I'm really excited about because it's something that just came in unexpectedly, it's something that just crossed my desk or actually popped into my inbox this morning. And it really speaks to an important topic for anybody who does or uses survey research. And that has to do with the importance of subgroup analysis. So let's take a look at this particular topic. The article that crossed my inbox today was about a university that had contracted with a consulting company to do a big study about perceptions of the university, right? Perceptions is a very common type of market research study. We often want to do studies to understand how do people perceive us? Do people have perceptions that we want to change? Do people have perceptions we want to better leverage or promote, right? So perceptions can be a very powerful sort of information for us to gather using survey research. And in this case, the university hired a consulting firm. It's not a firm I'd ever heard of before. Apparently, they do specialize in the education sector. And the firm did a study and then presented the study. And some of the professors in the audience had some questions that were, I think, really quite good. So just as background, the study included a sample size. It was a sample size of 550. 110 of the people were faculty. 112 were staff or administrators. 112 were support. So again, university employees. 18 were alumni and 192 were students. Would we have any concerns here? Well, the one thing that certainly jumps out at us is it seems odd that there were 18 alumni, right? It's a very small number of alumni. Let's just put that to the side for just an issue. Overall, though, we've got a good number of people who work for the university, and we've got a good number of students. All right, sounds like we've got some, reasonable sample size here, so we should have some good data to work with. But what was interesting was that in the presentation, the consultancy presented the data in aggregate. That is, when they reported the perceptions that they had found about the university, they reported them in total. X percent of our participants had perception, A, Y percent of the participants had perception B, etc. All right, well, one of the professors asked the question that I know I would have asked, which is, why aren't we seeing the analysis done by subgroup? And the consultant apparently sort of resisted this question. And so the professor's clarification was, would it be relevant to understand if students perceive the university differently than faculty and staff do? So what do you think? Would you find that to be a reasonable hypothesis, that perceptions of the university might vary between students and the people who work for the university? It seems to me like that's a pretty obvious hypothesis. And the consultant resisted, and their response was no, because you're not going to change who you are fundamentally. We need to understand that as a whole bucket, not individual buckets. That is, we need to understand the whole population's perceptions, not the perceptions of people from individual buckets. Now, this is a great example of a failure in critical thinking. So by reporting the overall percentages, have they actually shown us what the overall perceptions are? Maybe, but maybe not. This is really basic statistics 101, right? We don't know what the variability is. And so when we want to have some data that shows, hey, there's some universal attitudes or perceptions, we actually have to prove that. We can't just look at the overall averages and say it is so. What do we know about averages when we're looking at survey data? Averages can be extremely misleading. It's sort of like the example of some people, if you did a survey of people who drink coffee, and some people said, oh, I really like iced coffee, and other people said, I really like my coffee hot, what's the average? Room temperature. Oh, most people, the average was a room temperature preference. Completely misleading. Let me use a less sarcastic example. Let's imagine you did a survey of people who own cars, and you had people who have pickup trucks and people who have SUVs and another group was people who have four-door sedans. And you find that in aggregate, that 75% were satisfied with their current car. Let's even go make it a higher bar. 75% were extremely satisfied with their current car. Sounds pretty good, right? Wow, 3 different categories, and that's the overall result. But what if in reality, 90% of the pickup drivers were very satisfied, 40% of the SUV drivers were very satisfied, and 60% of the SUV drivers were very satisfied? Those 3 groups had very different results. When you took the average, maybe it worked out to 75%, but it's completely misleading. You have to be very careful in survey data when you're treating your data in aggregate if there are indeed important subgroups. In some cases, that might be subgroups by age range, by household income. There are a lot of different things that can really be at play. We have to be very careful about reporting data in aggregate. If the consultant's point of view is that we want to know what the universal perceptions are, great. Maybe there are some universal perceptions, but you don't get that by looking at the overall average. You actually determine that by looking at the subgroups and proving that there are no variations by subgroup. And sometimes that happens. I mean, I've absolutely done studies where I looked exhaustively at various attributes and determined, hey, no matter how we slice this data, this perception exists. Most people are extremely happy, or most people perceive your company as being environmentally responsible, whatever we're measuring. But you have to do the subgroup analysis in order to prove that. You can't just look at the overall data. If you're somebody who is, for some reason, really opposed to doing the subgroup analysis, then you have to at least let me know what the standard deviation was on those measures, right? So tell me what the variability was. I got a hunch that if they looked at the standard deviation on perceptions of the university, they would have seen some pretty big, fairly large amounts of variability. And I don't have a lot of experience doing research on university topics. I have done a few, but I've not done a ton of it. I can pretty much guarantee you that there's going to be some differences in the attitudes and perceptions of students versus faculty versus administrative staff. Again, do the subgroup analysis and prove it. Prove it that those attitudes are universal, or at least give me the standard deviation on those measures so I can take a look at it. But looking at the data as one bucket, because you're saying, well, we need to know the overall perception, that is just a failure in critical thinking. That's not how it works. So if you want to understand whether or not universal attitudes exist, you actually have to look at the data. You have to see whether or not there is variability in the data, and ideally do look at it by subgroup. Because even if by subgroup the differences aren't huge, but they exist, that can still be really actionable information. A lot of times when we're doing studies on perceptions of a brand, and a university is indeed a brand, one of the things that we want is, sure, we want to find out overall perceptions, but what if there's important subgroups that have negative perceptions or whose perceptions are less than the rest, right? Well, that might say to me, I need to do a campaign to that group to help move the needle here. Everybody has pretty positive perceptions of the university, but the students themselves are a little bit less on perceptions of the university's handling of the pandemic. Well, even if it's a small difference, that might be something that the university wants to be aware of, right? We certainly don't want it to become more of a gap between the students and everybody else. Or even sometimes with a small gap, you might want to put a little bit of effort into something. But clearly, it seems like a very likely hypothesis that there's going to be a difference there. So if you are working with a consultancy or a research firm and they're delivering data to you in aggregate, they're just saying overall X% said this and Y% said that, and they're resisting subgroup analysis, that would be a red flag to me. They should either be giving you the subgroup analysis or they should be giving you the standard deviation on all the measures so that you can see that there is indeed not a lot of variability. But to just sort of say no really kind of suggests the consultant isn't really very qualified to be doing this kind of work, to be perfectly candid. Any reputable consultancy or research firm would do the subgroup analysis and certainly happily give you your standard deviation data. It was a minor mention in the article, but the article did indicate that perhaps these folks were not being given access to the raw data, that the professors weren't being given access to the raw data. That would be a little concerning to me too. Usually, if you are hiring somebody to collect primary research for you, you as the client do get access to that data. There are exceptions. You may not, if it was an omnibus study or a multi-client study, you might not have access to the data. And there are some companies that have sort of black box analysis techniques. That's a whole nother pet peeve of mine, but they do exist. And they may not give you their, their secret algorithm to how they came up with certain measures, but they should certainly give you your raw survey data. So I hope this conversation was helpful. And I didn't want to name the university or the consultancy because there's probably more to this story than I saw in one article, but I'll put a link to the article in the notes below. If anybody has any questions, certainly let me know. I hope you found the conversation helpful. Do subscribe, do review on either YouTube or Apple Podcasts, and thanks for your time.